Good morning and welcome to the EDD High panel on the question of how can development cooperation effectively combat corruption and promote good governance and the rule of law in developing countries. My name is Davor Stier. I'm a member of the European Parliament, coming from Croatia. I'm the coordinator of the European People's Party in the Development Committee, and I will be serving today as your moderator this morning for this panel. I'm very glad that I'll be joined today by two colleagues from the European Parliament, Elly Schlein from the group of Socialists and Democrats, and Charles Goerens from the ALDE group, the Liberal group in the European Parliament. Today we will also have Madam Mariam Shuna. She is the Executive Director of Transparency International from the Maldives. Achim Steiner, the Executive Director of UNIP. We will have with us Dr. Heather Mackett. She is the Director of Research, the Developmental Leadership Program for the University of Birmingham. We have also with us Minister Konrad Pawlik. He is the Undersecretary of State for Development, Cooperation, Polish Diaspora and Eastern Policy of Poland. And then we will have a young but very potent voice from Brazil, Edglison Rodrigues. He is the coordinator for the youth monitoring of public policies in Brazil. So this will be our panel for today. They will be discussing the issues of corruption and development. But before we get to that point, let me just stress for those of you who have the EDD app, the application, that you can send your comments or questions to the panelists during this session. Be also aware that we have translation in English and French. The channel number 4 is for English, number 5 is for French. We will have two presentations that will not be in English, one in French and one in Portuguese, so if you want to use the translation. Now, this panel, organized by the Development Committee of the European Parliament, is focusing on the question of corruption because about $1 trillion every year is coming out from developing countries because of illicit capital flows, because of corruption. This is 10 times more than the official development assistance. So tackling corruption, strengthening the rule of law, good governance, is essential for sustainable development. Now, the question, of course, is how to tackle corruption, and is the European Union having the adequate strategy to do that? What are the experiences, not only in developing countries, but also in the Eastern neighborhood, that could be used in order to refocus our development cooperation policies? We have with us really a panel that is bringing a lot of expertise. And I would like to start now with Elly Schlein. She is the European Parliament's rapporteur for a report that has been approved now in committee on tax evasion and how this is hampering development. This report is going to be debated now in the plenary, so it's very timely that we hear from Elly about her thoughts about corruption and development. Elly, you have the floor. You have probably a mic? Yeah, there you go.
Thank you.
Is it working?
No, not yet.
Then we will have our assistants. Yeah.
Yes.
Please.
Thank you. Thank you, Davor. Good morning, everyone. Dear colleagues and guests, I'm very pleased to be here today. I'm Elly Schlein, MEP from the S&D group. I'm also part of the Development Committee and co-president of the intergroup at the Parliament on integrity, transparency, corruption, and organized crime. And of course, as my colleague Stier just said, I had the chance to be the rapporteur on the Davis Initiative report on tax avoidance and tax evasion as challenges for governance, social protection, and development in developing countries that was approved last Monday in the DEVE committee. The issue of good governance and fight against corruption is one of the great revolutions of the new Sustainable Development Goals. The previous framework did not include any governance goals regarding the issues of transparency, accountability, and anti-corruption. This time, after delicate negotiations, we have a standalone goal dealing on good governance with the 3 key priorities of accountability, transparency, and anti-corruption. So I'm looking forward to a fruitful debate today, so I would just give some food for thought here, very shortly. Corruption has a huge impact on economic development, aid, public service delivery, state legitimacy, and also inequalities. The growing inequalities within and across countries which have become a growing concern in developed and developing countries, and should be, I think, at the very heart of the post-2015 development agenda debate. In this regard, corruption can certainly be defined as a regressive tax, which affects the poorest and the most vulnerable parts of society. And the high perception of corruption between citizens, I know something about it, I'm from Italy, undermines the credibility of the institution, of course, and the trust in public institutions. And that's why we see the connection between corruption, good governance, and development, of course. Talking about taxes, I want to underline and say a few words on the need of transparent tax policies in view of the definition of the new Sustainable Development Goals and the Addis Ababa Conference on Financing for Development. Tax systems need to be made more transparent to limit tax avoidance and illicit financial flows. As you said before, they represent today 10 times more than official development assistance. And of course, it's a huge problem. You know, I think that this means, for example, that developed countries ought to demand transparency from companies operating under their jurisdiction, with those companies required to publicly demonstrate where they are operating and their tax compliance. Of course, in the report we just voted, we, of course, ask for information on beneficial ownership. 70% of the whole cases of global corruption involve phantom firms, for example, with lack of transparency, so that's why we have to act immediately on the issue. And of course, in the report, we also address the country-by-country reporting, asking for thorough information to be given to all authorities from the companies to avoid, of course, to fight profit shifting and tax avoidance. And we also talk about automatic exchange of information that has not to be reciprocal, because, of course, some developing countries don't have today the competence and the infrastructure to give all the information. That's why if we ask for them to be reciprocal, we would risk to exclude them right now, and we have to avoid this. It means also that before lowering corporate tax rates, we have to tackle corruption and tax dodging as a priority in developing countries. In recent years, we have seen governments of developing countries lowering, of course, tax rates and offering various types of tax incentives and exemptions with the aim of attracting investors and fostering economic growth. However, evidence shows that these incentives are not an important driver for foreign investments. Investors are more likely to be driven into a country by other factors, such as good infrastructure or no corruption or bribery, for example. So we have many instruments, and of course, the panelists are going to give much more information than I can on that. But here, let me just say, the question is, are the instruments at international level, like, for example, the OECD Anti-Bribery Convention or the Extractive Industries Transparency Initiative, how much do they have an impact, would I ask to our panelists today? And are developing countries well represented here? Because it's, of course, in goal number 16 in the Sustainable Development Goals, it explicitly states, we have to broaden and strengthen the participation of developing countries in the institution of global governments. So that's the question here. And of course, that's why we ask in the report for the UN Taxation Committee to be transformed into a genuine intergovernmental body equipped with additional resources, ensuring that developing countries can finally participate on an equal foot to the, of course, discussion around global tax, international tax rules. One last thing, let me just just say how it's important to have meaningful indicators to measure and evaluate progress for every goal and target in the SDGs. And it's not easy to, of course, measure progress on reducing corruption and bribery. So I would also love to hear something about that. And last but not least, civil society organizations play a very important role in monitoring corruption. That's why I think we have to insist on the protection of whistleblowers, for example. Thank you very much, and let's just have a fruitful discussion today.
Thank you, Ellie. Ellie Schlein is a new member of the European Parliament, but you can see she is one of the most articulated voices for sustainable development already. So I think we can greet her also with a very clap and thank for that intervention. Now, for those of you who would like to use internet, you have the password there, but it will work only in this room, so not outside the room. Now, let's move now talking about articulated voices. Charles Goerens is probably the established voice in the Development Committee. He is a member there that is respected across the board, from the center-right to the center-left. They usually say the liberals are the kingmakers in the European Parliament, but he has a king's voice when it comes to development. Charles Goerens, please.
C'est très gentil de me présenter comme le most established.
Well, that was very kind of you to introduce me as the most established member of the Development Committee. I think in plain English that means I'm the oldest. It's a very elegant way of telling the truth, I think. Thank you very much for inviting me to be here with you. I'll try and be as pragmatic as possible, really. You've invited me to share my experience with you in terms of follow-up to policies and compliance with good management principles. I will tell you a little story from about 15 years ago. I won't name names, but a head of state and government from an African country, and I've told this story many times before, said to me, "Listen, I've just been elected to the head of a state that's corrupt. My state is corrupt because my civil servants are corrupt. They are corrupt because I don't pay them very much. I don't pay them very much because there's nothing in my budget. My budget is low because the economy is not working well. The economy is not working well because nobody wants to invest in my country. And nobody wants to invest in my country because people tell me, well, we don't want to invest because your state is corrupt." It's a vicious circle. And just imagine how long it would take to turn that vicious circle into a virtuous circle. I mean, what do we do with that type of state? I mean, there's not just one state like that, is there? We have comparable levels of development in the EU. We can perhaps share our experience, but we can also learn lessons from other countries. So let's not be arrogant about this. Let's try to be open-minded. Let's try to be humble in this discussion. What can we do in that type of situation that I described to you? At the time, a member state of the European Union, in order to try and break this vicious circle, had decided to pay the salaries of the central administration in that country to make those people that were in charge more independent. That way they would be less dependent on the bribes. Now, I think that's a good start, but it's not a sustainable solution because you cannot ad infinitum finance the central administration of a state from outside, but it's a good starting point. Secondly, I think you also have to acknowledge that in those states, the management functions of the people in charge are not carried out in a sufficient way. The state or the republic is not sufficiently present. In some regions, like the Congo, that's a very corrupt country, the state is incapable of being present everywhere. So there's a lack of security. Everything is allowed because the state can't intervene where it needs to. In that kind of situation, there you see there is a real role for non-state actors. We, as representatives of institutions, we'll have to find our counterparts in other institutions. When we draw up a development program in the EU with another country, we have to speak or dialogue with the state or some kind of state body. Now, how do we do that? How do we get non-state actors involved then? Well, in that case, you still have to do that via negotiations with the state. So in Congo, you'd have to negotiate and ensure that there's a secure space to dialogue with non-state actors. This will perhaps back up your description of me as an established member, but in 2000, I had the opportunity of participating in several meetings on the negotiation of the Cotonou Agreement. And there, it was the European side that practically had to impose the fact that civil society be involved in the Cotonou Agreement, because those on the other side of the table didn't share our view at all. So that is the time when you have to really invite all actors, all players to be involved, especially if the state is not capable of intervening. Because then you have to find somebody else, non-state actors, civil society in that case. Now, we have a role to play as well when it comes to promotion of good conduct and good governance. And it's certainly in our interest to have reliable dialogue partners that we can speak to. Reliable in the sense that they can be accountable. We have to obviously bring them on board in terms of the political dialogue. They have to be able to be in a position to take that post. Now, budgetary aid, I am very attached to that because it allows the country to emancipate itself, but it will be more successful to contribute to healthy development in those countries if the budgetary aid is controlled by parliaments. And obviously they take up their prerogatives then, but if it's controlled by parliaments and civil society, it has more of a chance of being successful. So I think there's a role here, and I agree with Ellie. She's carried out some excellent work on the extractive industry and conflict minerals and conflict ores. And I think she's right. We have to take responsibility for this, because I think the general environment, the general climate also influences the microclimate in these countries. So we have to shoulder our responsibility as well. I mean, we can not just ignore the illicit flows that there are and separate them out completely from financial flows and other flows. If there are legal flows where there's a financing of technological transfers, then that's fine. But if these financial flows are going towards keeping up the dictator's lifestyle that he's accustomed to, well, that's not acceptable. And there, of course, we'd have to ensure that we stop these things from happening.
For that, I think that your intervention showed really why I said that you are regarded with high respect from all the corners in the European Parliament. May we thank you for that. And as I said, the voice of the civil society, to have also good interlocutors in addition to the government, and to have a good oversight, not only for Parliament, also from the civil society, is important. We will have in the second part of this panel, of course, the voice of the civil society and the academia as well. But now let's turn to one question, and this is how corruption is also having a negative impact on all the efforts to protect the environment. And that's why we have invited Achim Steiner, the Executive Director of the United Nations Environment Programme, and he will address this issue for us. Achim, please, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, and good morning to all of you. In just a few minutes, let me sketch out why the link between governance, corruption, and the environment is not a marginal issue. It is, in fact, massive. It is material to our economies, to our security as societies, and also as a global community of nations. And it is also multi-tiered in the kind of responses, because part of the question that you posed this morning is how can the development cooperation agenda also be a constructive and effective partner to countries in addressing this issue. When we talk about the link between environment, governance, and corruption, let me first of all give to you a sense of what are we talking about here, and very quickly you realize quite how massive the implications are. We talk about land, we talk about water, we talk about timber, we talk about wildlife, both flora and fauna, illegally traded. We talk about the redistribution of assets in countries from one group to another. When you transform a river from being a free-flowing river that supports sometimes hundreds of thousand-year-old communities that practice agriculture into a hydropower generating infrastructure, you are essentially redistributing the functionality of a river basin from one group of people to another. Now, all of this can be done very legitimately, transparently, within the rule of law, or it can be done through bad governance, through corruption, and ultimately, it is theft practiced at an incredible scale. So, massive. Why do I say that? Last year, UNEP and Interpol published a report on environmental crime. It was the first attempt to try and get an economic figure into this shady world of the illegal trade in natural products, wildlife, flora, and fauna. And we arrived at the staggering figure of close to over $200 billion. And we are very conscious of the fact that this is the tip of the iceberg that you can see. But that just gives you a sense of the scale of the value of illegally traded flora and fauna products as we can basically track them in general today. $200 billion. This is a very significant force. Secondly, let me also say it is massive in terms of scale. A few years ago, UNEP and Indonesia jointly published a report trying to assess how much of Indonesia's timber logging operations were in fact truly licensed and therefore transparently transacted. And we both arrived at the conclusion that over 70%, this was 5 years ago, of Indonesia's timber that was being logged was illegally logged and exported. So it never registered in the national economic indicators. It was essentially outside the frame of law in terms of logging, but also in terms of taxation, revenues to communities and to national treasuries. If you take the issue of the illegal trade in wildlife products today, it is an international trade facilitated by criminal syndicates. And the fungibility between trading, for example, in human beings, in weapons, in drugs, and in flora and fauna is increasingly being blurred. These are simply different products. These are offshore operated criminal syndicates. They operate internationally from source countries to transit countries to destination countries. The operations are massive, and they are beginning to threaten entire ecosystems within countries, species survival. We are talking about an economic force of illegal use that is very much a massive and therefore also material, and that is my second point, to the economies of local communities, to national economies, and ultimately also to an international economy that is, through this illegal trade, financing conflict. And this is also the link to security and conflict. A significant part of our work in this domain in UNEP looks at the link between conflicts and natural resources, governance, corruption, and the illegal trade. And the Environmental Crime Report, and I urge you, if you're interested, on unep.org, you can find this report, gives you many of the illustrations and tracks these movements. But also it demonstrates that, for instance, something that we never really paid attention to, charcoal. In Africa, charcoal has emerged as the major currency for financing conflict. From the Horn of Africa into East Africa, across the Sahel into Nigeria and Mali, you today have essentially conflict being financed and transacted beyond the normal financial system through the use of charcoal. And this is not in the $1 or $2 million range, this is in the tens of billions of dollars. Thirdly, let me just say that the response must be multi-tiered. It begins with transparency, and I'm sure you will speak to that in a moment. Transparency is fundamental. Accountability follows from transparency, because only that way can you do it. I think legislation and the rule of law and the environmental rule of law, something that the United Nations very much focuses on, is critical. And we as international partners can help countries to create the conditions for transparency information, the institutions and platforms for accountability, the laws by which countries can both enforce, and this is the fourth dimension, enforcement, and finally, fifth, international cooperation. We have to recognize that the notion of linking governance and corruption is not simply a national issue. It is driven from outside, beyond the borders, by a global economy, and it is less about lecturing and finger-pointing, because let us be honest, these issues are as prevalent in some of our countries as they are sometimes more crudely in developing economies. It's a matter of working in partnership to reinforce the accountability and enforcement mechanisms. Thank you.
Achim, thank you very much for bringing us this perspective. Actually reinforces this idea that the environment agenda certainly should be merged with the development one, that we cannot just go through separate courses in this sense. Now, let me turn to Minister Konrad Pawlik. He is the Undersecretary of State for Development Cooperation, the Polish diaspora, and Eastern policy of Poland. You have been working very hard also in the Eastern Partnership, developing some strategies to prevent and combat corruption there. So please, we will be very interested in hearing your views on this subject.
Thank you very much. And I'm very glad to be here and to have a chance to share a little bit of our experience in the Eastern dimension, in the dimension of Eastern Partnership countries. Probably some of you already know that 60% of Polish aid goes to the Eastern Partnership countries. And quite good number of projects is related to good governance, rule of law, and anti-corruption. So these projects produced some experience that we would like to share here and to point out. Let me just say that for the beginning, of course, I agree with colleagues in the panel that corruption is one of the biggest obstacle to the development, reduces poverty, but also progress and growth of the democratic civil societies. We agree with Secretary General Ban Ki-moon, who said, I think 3 years ago, that 20 to 30% of aid globally is lost to corruption. Corruption control is the most fundamental component of good governance, since it subverts all other values of good governance. Coming back to something what I mentioned at the beginning, namely the experience of the Eastern Partnership countries, where we observe still a struggle with quite rampant corruption. Let me just say that the very first challenge is this circle which was mentioned by one of the colleagues here, the closed circle. To address effectively development cooperation, we believe it's important to at least try to create certain gaps into this circle. The first thing is education. Everything starts from the school. Education is a key to education. Prevention against corruption in the education system is absolutely crucial. We address several projects to the education system. Very crucial is to address it towards creating a transparent, equal, and homogenic system of examination and grading. So it basically leads to the proper and adequate grading and examination system. Out of education system is created an elite that will be able to fight corruption and prevent corruption. The second issue is of course enforcement. Most of the countries in the Eastern Partnership region has proper legislation in place, but the problem is effective enforcement. And this is also the key, how to create an effective enforcement in fighting corruption. So we believe that proper creation of remuneration system to the civil servants, to the civil service that is good elite which is able to handle the corruption is a key. The good example is Georgia. Georgia, that over a decade really changed from the country that was highly corrupt to the country that is one of the examples in the post-Soviet area of real progress in terms of fighting corruption and improving and producing good governance. The second thing is decentralization. Most post-Soviet countries were economies of shortages, were centrally planned economies. They are all the time in the process of transition. The transition there is not over. Part of the transition is, of course, decentralization. Decentralization, which means that empowers people locally. Empowerment of the people locally does not mean that the centralization of the competences to the local authorities. It also means the creation of the democratic societies at the local level. What we have done and what we have focused on in our development cooperation is also not just to advise how to do effective decentralization, but also how to create a local media and local societies that are able to deliver certain surveillance over the local authorities and to effectively cope with corruption. So let me stop here. I'm open for your comments and questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Minister, for that. We heard the voice of the voices, actually, of the European Parliament, of the international organizations of the UNEP, and, of course, of one of our member states. We will hear, of course, the voice of academia and the civil society in the second part of this panel. But just to be a dynamic panel and participatory, let's take now 2 or 3 questions from you, from the audience, who would like to pose to the panelists so far. So may I invite you now to just raise your hands and if you want to put a question to one of the 4 panelists who already participated in this debate. Yes, please. If we can just bring the mic to you in a second. Yeah, here in the middle. If you can please introduce yourself very briefly. I will give you 1 minute. Please, no comments, just a question.
Thank you very much. Caroline Croker. I'm an international consultant working on transparency and accountability. You mentioned budget support to governments. We know the European Union has passed a new budget support policy. So my question very briefly is, to what extent there have already been measures to ensure that budget support is always attached to local accountability processes where civil society has a role? Thank you.
Thank you very much for that. We will continue taking some questions and then we will hear the answers. I saw some hands there. Please, if you can just take the mic, introduce yourself.
Hello, my name is Theodore. I am training at EDD15, but I'm also interested in the Eastern Partnership, and that's why I would like to address one question to the Secretary. Apart from the issues connected with good governance, is the Polish development assistance directed in certain policies, let's say energy efficiency, or let's say blading facilities, or trying to bring new finance for finding energy in the Eastern Partnership? And on the whole, do you see any diffusion or nexuses with the development assistance? Can you bring development assistance to the Eastern Partnership somehow?
Thank you very much. We will now move to this side of the audience. Here we have a gentleman who would like also to put a question. If you can just bring, here is the mic, yeah. And then we will take one more there, and with this we will finish the first round of questions. Please introduce yourself.
Geert Heikens, a former EU head of delegation in a couple of developing countries. One question of more than trying to have a direction. Again, and in many of the discussions on corruption, etc., I see a lot of, we are talking about the receiving countries, the receiving parties. We are always finger pointing to those who receive. But corruption has 2 sides. Yes, and also here in this panel, I hardly hear anything about those who give. Maybe we should have invited somebody of the FIFA in the panel. But I would also like to have some attention. It's not only in corruption those who receive, it's equally those who paid. I'm myself convinced, I have no proof, that the first bribe in the world was not somebody who asked, but somebody who offered. And I would like to see the other aspect also, and not only the finger pointing to the receiving less developed countries.
Thank you very much for that. It was a question and a statement at the same time, and then we will take the last question in this round. Please, go ahead.
Merci beaucoup.
Thank you very much. Yolande Matelin from the University of Lorraine in Nancy, France. I have a question for the members of Parliament. Mentioning the good work that they do, of course, more work has to be done. But in relation to ACP countries, you've mentioned Congo, Mr. Member of Parliament. In the Cotonou Agreement, there is an Article 96 which refers to what you have called essential elements, including good governance and democracy, the rule of law, etc. Now, how can development cooperation effectively fight corruption? Well, this is in the title. To fight against corruption, well, apart from the fact that you have a corruptor and a corrupted, that's true. I think the first question we should address in relation to African states is, what is the role of the ACP states in economic growth of the European Union? If we answer this question first, then we could address the second question. What is the position of the EU vis-à-vis the BRICS, the role of the BRICS in Africa today? And once we have answered those two questions, then I think we would indeed be able to find solutions to fight corruption effectively. Thank you.
So we got 4 questions about budget support, the Eastern Partnership, the Blatter question, and then the ACP question to our colleagues from the European Parliament. May I suggest that we go this way, the other way around, just to finish with our colleagues from the European Parliament. Minister, if you want to go first.
Yes, thank you. Let me answer for the question on energy efficiency and Eastern Partnership. Yes, we see the huge challenge in the Eastern Partnership countries in energy efficiency. Just one figure, which is very indicative. If Ukraine would have an energy efficiency as Czech Republic, they wouldn't import gas from Russia. So this shows how big challenge we have there. And energy efficiency is also addressed in the Polish aid. It's not a significant part of our support to Eastern Partnership countries. As I mentioned, one of the most leading projects are decentralization reform and anti-corruption. But we participate in E5P program. We also facilitated some funds for energy efficiency projects in Ukraine, Moldova, and Georgia. We are also helping on so-called thermomodernization programs, translated proper legislation, sent a group of experts in the past, during several years. So we are also quite active. We also created a so-called new technology, renewable technology platform called Greenevo that promotes Polish technology in renewables and energy efficiency, for instance, solar panels, etc. So we are also quite active in this regards, of course, adequately to our possibilities and financial and technological one. So, thank you.
Thank you. Achim, would you like to offer the thoughts of UNEP?
Quickly, again, emphasize, I agree very much with your comments just now that it is not only the recipient. And I think we need to understand that corruption has, an international dimension, it has a local dimension. Both are drivers and it involves two sides. But I think the important part is that we have to create visibility and transparency. Only then can we begin to challenge this. And I think the work that Mariama does with transparency, for example, in the Maldives or many other civil society organizations are critical. The work that we do as an international community very often is about trading, for example, with the United Nations Office on Drugs and Crime. We try and track where are the financial flows going, where is the demand coming from, what is driving it, who is benefiting. But ultimately, it is citizens empowered with information, and secondly, with a rule of law domestically anchored, because this is where people can challenge development. And there are very interesting developments. In India, for example, the green tribunals, when you come to environment and corruption and governance, or a environmental prosecutor service in Mexico. These are the kinds of institutions where good partnerships can help. And finally, let me say the journey of the European Union and its own governance framework, I think, is one that is worth sharing, because it is a decades-long journey in trying to address good governance and corruption also in our own context. And it's less about lecturing, as you say, but it is about sharing and understanding what is most powerful in driving the domestic, local accountability frameworks. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We are a little bit behind schedule, but that's why we have our two colleagues from the European Parliament. In the European Parliament, we are used to 1-minute speeches. So I will ask Ellie and then Charles to conclude this first round of our panel. Ellie, if you want to go first.
Okay. About the question that came from there, you are absolutely right. I mean, we have to tackle both sides of the problem. That's why in our work in the Parliament, we started from the fact that these are global challenges. We don't have much to teach to other countries in terms of tax evasion and tax avoidance. We know that. And also in terms of corruption, I was, of course, mentioning my own country, Italy. We have some experience. And that's the spirit, I think. We have some expertise because we know these problems. We are trying. We're still struggling to face them. And that's the spirit with which we have to see that they are global challenges. They're not at a national level anymore. In the days in which you can move very easily huge amounts of capital from one side of the other of the world. It's of course something we have to keep in mind. And let me say that that's why to tackle it on both sides, we have to work, of course, on supporting with technical assistance and financial assistance of course the fiscal authorities of developing countries to be stronger, and also to be stronger to react to those multinational companies who actually try to profit from that kind of agreements, too often taken ad hoc and without transparency. So that's the fact. We have to, I think, to keep that very, very strictly in mind.
Merci. Deux questions m'ont été adressées plus directement.
Thank you. Two questions have been put to me directly. One question from the gentleman at the back of the room, saying that there are donors, or rather active corruptors and passive corrupting factors. Our report on the mining conflicts is a direct answer to your question, because there we are pointing the finger at those companies that do not apply the codes, and I think the European Parliament is doing its work. We've been very strict in relation to this, and I hope that the Member States will support us on this. Now, the second question that was put by a lady in the middle of the room, in relation to parliamentary scrutiny and civil society scrutiny as a condition for granting budget aid. Once again, I have to say we're very modest in our approach. I'm not going to go to an African country where the parliament is not as involved as we would like, because the European Development Fund is not controlled either by the European Parliament nor by national parliaments. We keep asking for the budgetization of the European Development Fund. For decades we've been doing this. Of course, we can monitor what is happening in relation to this from the point of view of the Parliament. But the last element in my response is that there are very intelligent solutions that can be identified. In budget aid, there are several approaches. You have the sectoral approach, which is also monitored by the donors, of course, those countries on whose behalf the money is being spent. And there's also a dynamic approach in budgetary aid. In other words, if you don't meet all the requirements, then there has to be a process And at the end of the process, you have to be able to satisfy all the conditions, meet all the requirements. So I hope also that the parliaments will be involved in being able to monitor, for example, the aid that comes in as soft loans. And here I'd like the opinion from Transparency International. And I'm just stating a hypothesis here, that most of these sources of soft loans are sources of corruption too, or of possible sources. If I lend $1 billion to an African head of government and he doesn't reimburse any of it, but he gives me rights for mining rights, that is sort of a bartering situation. And how do you define the terms for this? It's someone who gives, someone who receives in exchange. If you could put this all in terms of monetary terms, then perhaps we could make the debate more objective. But I feel that this is a conclusion that could be drawn. But could you confirm this or not? I think the parliaments and the receiving countries and civil society have the right to have clarification given on this. Thank you.
And you were mentioned already several times in this panel, so I think it would be now the right time that you start with the second part of this panel. Mariam Shiuna is the Executive Director, Transparency International Maldives. You have the floor.
Thank you. Good morning, everyone. Let me just start by saying that I'm delighted to be part of this panel. I have come from a long way, all the way from the Maldives, to share with you some of my experiences of running an anti-corruption NGO in my country. As mentioned, I work for Transparency Maldives, which is the national chapter for Transparency International in the Maldives. My organization was formed in 2008 when the Maldives experienced its democratic transition following 30 years of authoritarian rule. And we, in my country, operate as the only anti-corruption NGO, but we do not only take anti-corruption as our only cause, because we operate in a society where only a handful of advocacy NGOs operate, and we also carry the flag for civil society, and we promote democratic values, norms, and practices in my country, because we believe that corruption cannot be tackled without promoting democratic institutions and norms in society. I operate in a very challenging environment, but I think over the past few years, we have made some headways in terms of fighting corruption, and I'll just share with you briefly some of the interventions where we have taken where I've seen it work. So over the past 5 years, we've been campaigning for a freedom of information law in the country. We lobbied with parliamentarians, traveled around the country to mobilize RTI activists, and talked about right to information through various mediums over the past 5 years. And in January 2014, as a result of our work, a landmark Right to Information Act was passed in my country. So today, whenever I see an article where journalists had used the RTI Act to access information, which would have been something impossible before 2014, it makes what we do worthwhile, and you realize the impact of the work that you do. And we also operate a free legal advice center for victims and witnesses of corruption. As a result of our work, we have helped hundreds of migrant workers that come to the Maldives to work in the construction industry, where many of these are victims of corruption, where their wages have not been paid for months, where they live in appalling conditions. And as a result of this legal advice that we provide to victims, we have been able to help hundreds of migrant workers. And in one of our efforts to promote good governance in the Maldives has been to promote decentralization of power in the country, and by extension, strengthen local governance. As part of our work, we have trained hundreds of local councillors over the years, traveled across the country to facilitate town hall style meetings so local councillors can be accountable to the communities that they govern, and also build community trust. So when we started these town hall style meetings, this is something that never took place in the country, but right now I'm proud to say that we have hundreds of islands or local communities that actually hold these civic forums or town hall style meetings. But with these advances that I talk about, it comes with a lot of risk for my organization and for my staff. Because talking about corruption obviously makes the corrupt nervous and make them overreact. We operate under an environment where the state continues to threaten to dissolve the organization. for the public commentary we make on the political and social developments in the country. And we also operate under physical security threats to my staff on a daily basis. So there's a lot of pressure and public expectation on my organization to comment on all aspects of governance issues in the country, because we have very limited NGOs that undertake watchdog functions in my country. But I think what we have done so far, I believe we've only scratched the surface in terms of curbing corruption in my country. But what I want to say is that what we have demonstrated so far is that why it's important to support and empower local agents like us, and that the work of a single NGO, even if it's just one, can make a huge difference in a country in terms of fighting corruption. And that is why I believe that development aid should do more to support and empower local agents in fighting corruption. So without making my speech too long, but let me just highlight, based on my experience, 3 key strategies that I think all aid agencies should think when it comes to fighting corruption in developing countries. One is that corruption cannot be tackled just through technical fixes in a country. Anti-corruption agencies, units exist in my country. We have laws, we have anti-corruption laws in my country, but this is not enough. There needs to be a broad range of actors incorporated locally, particularly civil society organizations, to achieve change, especially in countries like the Maldives, where we have a history and culture of secrecy and authoritarianism. And second, I also believe that change can only be achieved through long-term investment. In my work, and much to my frustration, I quite often have to battle with donors that expect me to change values and people's attitudes with 6-month programs. And expect me to, quite often we are required to come up with successful indicators, which are incredible and something you cannot achieve. And this is just for the sake of number crunching. But change in values and change in people's attitudes, it often takes change. It's a generational change and should start in the socialization years of young people. And that is why I think to tackle corruption, there needs to be a long-term investment in order to see behavioral change in people, because without behavioral change, we cannot fight corruption, despite having anti-corruption laws or institutions in the country. And finally, based on my country, I also want to note that corruption cannot be addressed nor good governance achieved without strengthening democratic institutions in the country. I say this as my country is backtracking in the democratic gains we made since 2008. Given the current political developments in my country, right now, there is a lot of work to be done to regain all the freedoms that we seem to be losing every day. Because if we cannot speak freely about corruption, because we cannot speak of corruption without freedom of expression, media cannot write about corruption if they cannot operate freely, and heads of independent institutions or oversight bodies cannot operate independently if they operate under fear of losing their jobs or security threats. The same with civil society in my country. So this is basically the situation in my country, but I do understand every country has its own corruption profile, and every country has its own type of corruption, and political context may vary in different countries. But these interventions, but I think these 3 broad strategies I believe will make anti-corruption interventions more effective and lasting in developing countries. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you not only for your intervention, but of course all your efforts. And as you have said, the importance also of having a strategy that is sustainable in time. And that also includes a new generation that is fighting for that cause. And that's why I will turn now to Edwin Rodriguez. He is only 22 years old, coming from Brazil, but he will present what is he doing there in terms of his engagement as coordinator of the youth monitoring of public policies. So you will have your 4 to 5 minutes. We will be delighted to hear your insights. You will speak in Portuguese, so those of you who would like to use the headphones, you can do it now. Please, you have the floor.
Bom dia a todos.
Good morning, everyone. First of all, I'd like to say it's a pleasure to be here representing Brazilian youth. I must tell you, when I was invited to speak about corruption, I was a little bit taken aback. I thought, oh my gosh, what a difficult topic. Am I really going to be able to talk about corruption on behalf of the youth then? Well, the young people need to be involved in this debate, because to fight against corruption is not just a matter of creating laws. laws, but also strengthening moral and educational values in our society. And if you don't work with the young people, then we'll continue strengthening the culture of corruption. We need to destroy this culture of corruption. Corruption is not normal. When you're going to take advantage of something, you know, it isn't just money. There are all sorts of forms of corruption. So the points that I want to focus on, what I'm going to say is you cannot fight against corruption if you don't have good governance. And the other point I'd like to make is in trying to establish good practices, people have to have the proper conditions to be able to improve our governance. I have a good practice to share with you. In Fortaleza, where I work with young people, I'm part of the Youth Monitoring Group of Public Policies, a national group supported by an international group also, working with young people and teenagers to give support for justice and working in communities. We're working daily with public policies. And I want to say that young people need to be involved in these discussions. Young people need to know how and with what the public budget is being spent, how it's being spent. Young people need to be actively involved in decision-making. So I believe that public governance is the best way to have this shared management, shared between civil society and the government and the public authorities, because civil society has to be involved actively in decision-making. Throughout all the government processes, civil society needs to participate, whether in the process of designing public policies or in the process of discussing and debating them, but mainly at the stage of monitoring public policies. Because nobody will know otherwise how all the money is being spent properly. Without good governance and without transparency, the population and young people won't know how the money is being spent. So it is necessary to set up these consolidated mechanisms involving local government with mutual dialogue between civil society and the government, because it is in this way that people will have a clearer view of what is happening, and you'll have involvement of the population, and public policies will reflect the interests of the population. I think that people need, in the government particularly, to encourage young people to be able to participate in all of these processes through not only training, but also contact just directly with people through education from very early on. I think young people have to be taught that corruption is not normal. People have to have the knowledge and become involved in active policy making and applying. They have to play their role as citizens. So it's a challenge for the young people, and young people need to know how I can support the development of my country. How can we really have sustainable development corresponding to the needs of the population without good governance? And to create good governance means creating cooperation among the various social stakeholders, young people, communities, parents, mothers and fathers, the government and the private sector. These are all stakeholders which will contribute to our public governance, governance being applied properly. Corruption is a problem in many countries, in Brazil as well, but we also have very positive developments over the past 10 years of government with this political development and managed shared management with networks has increased. This means that the young people and the population at large are becoming more involved in these processes, and we have the law of access to the information. Today, the population knows where and with what the budget is being spent. We need to have this good governance strengthened to fight against corruption. So we need to establish these good practices and encourage the application of these good practices. Thank you.
Obrigado, Edlison. You are already a potent voice for good governance in your country. You show that today. And now let's ask the Dr. Heather Market from the University of Birmingham if you can, with your academic approach, just bring to an end the second round of this high panel. You have the floor.
Thank you very much, and it's a pleasure to be here. We all understand that in many countries, development assistance is under pressure, and there's a sense that aid must lead to results. And as we've already heard, we need to be able to measure those results. The UK's Department for International Development, DFID, has commissioned not one, but 2 evidence papers since 2012 focused on corruption and anti-corruption. Both have told a very similar story. With some notable exceptions, there is very little evidence that anti-corruption approaches work. The message coming out of the research is we need to start thinking about doing anti-corruption programming differently, but we don't really know what this actually means yet. We can look around and see lots of examples where we seem to be losing the fight against corruption, but there are also plenty of reasons to be optimistic. Everyone associates Brazil with football and the World Cup, but few outsiders expected to see Brazilians pouring out onto the streets to protest the competition being hosted in the summer of 2014. In over 100 cities, over 1 million people rallied by social media came together to speak out against the high cost of soon-to-be superfluous stadiums, police brutality, and other forms of corruption. Fans held signs high that said FIFA go home and the World Cup of corruption. Over $15 billion was spent, but only 10% of what was promised for schools and healthcare seems to have made its way. Brazilians made it clear that they had enough and they were not going to be placated even by football. Even 20 years ago, such protests would have been unthinkable, but Brazil has had decades now of anti-corruption reforms. TI has noted some of these: better anti-corruption and transparency legislation, increasing evidence of judicial independence, which means that corruption is perhaps increasingly not being seen as being normal, and impunity is no longer guaranteed for the powerful. An increased number of investigations and arrests for corruption, an impressively free media, and an increasingly active civil society. My Brazilian colleagues may agree or disagree with me, but as an outsider, even though it looks like there's still clearly work to be done, these are really impressive achievements that are leading to transformational change. So what does this mean? I'd like to pull out 2 takeaway messages here. Firstly, in line with what Miriam was saying, the way we try to measure anti-corruption success, they're deeply flawed. All of the reforms in Brazil and many others are responsible for the changing landscape, but it's impossible to trace those back to a single project or program or donor. Any of these results are a patchwork quilt, so to speak, and they've taken many, many years to bear fruit. Sometimes it takes a particular scandal or some sort of critical juncture to help us to understand that these anti-corruption approaches have actually worked. And this is why the results-based agenda in development cooperation is so difficult and really problematic for fighting corruption. Simply put, even the most ambitious anti-corruption programs are unlikely to lead to transformational change in the sort of timeframes that we talk about when it comes to development assistance. We need to design approaches differently to take this into account, and we need to find alternative ways to measure success. After all, the lack of evidence may not actually mean that anti-corruption work isn't working. It just might mean that we don't know how to measure that success yet. My second and final point is that indirect approaches to fighting corruption may actually be more effective than direct ones. Thinking about Brazil as an example, there isn't a single anti-corruption agency, but there's a plethora of different agencies that all serve different purposes. There have been a huge number of reforms and initiatives, not all of ones which were designed as anti-corruption ones. Perfect it may not be, but it is certainly changing norms and behaviors over time. The problem is that corruption is a very emotive word. It's something that hits us in the gut, but it actually means a great many things. And what we try to do is we take many, many different activities and behaviors and we fit it under one umbrella, which is anti-corruption. We need to improve transparency and accountability, reduce police brutality, make money laundering much more difficult, increase political participation, all of these things that other colleagues up here have talked about. But all of these, the list could go on, and we try to do it in single programs often, and we try to find single ways to measure them, and it's extremely difficult. We need to maybe perhaps stop thinking about anti-corruption, but focus on the plethora of problems and the plethora of solutions. It may be much more difficult to articulate that to skeptical donor publics, but that should be the least of our concern. And it may actually make those initiatives slightly easier to measure as well. To sum up, we know that there are no magic bullets in anti-corruption, but we know that despite this, our governments and our publics as well expect development cooperation to provide technical support for anti-corruption, and they expect it somehow to work increasingly in some of the most dangerous and most difficult environments in the world. How it happens is not actually very clear, and we do need to take this lack of evidence more seriously and think instead about ways to do this work differently. We need to do this to ensure that the next anti-corruption evidence paper that DFID commissions, which will hopefully not be in the near future, will give them the better answer that they want. Thank you.
Thank you. Dr. Marquette, thank you very much. You certainly did not speak a diplomatic language. You sent very clear messages, and I'm sure that some of the panelists would like to comment on that. But before, we will ask again our audience to raise their hands and to put questions. Again, please introduce yourself and be short. Try not to make a comment, but just to put a very clear question. Well, we have actually a colleague from the European Parliament here that would like to put a question. So please, if you could just get a microphone.
Thank you very much. My name is Arne Lietz. I'm a German member of the Social Democratic Group here in the European Parliament for Development. Thank you very much for your very encouraging statement. What I would like to know, what you're doing in Brazil, particularly in your group, like what are you presenting and who is with you on this journey you're trying to get influence. The second question is, Mr. Steiner, you talked on the report you have brought out in the United Nations. Have you received already feedback from the European Parliament? Do you see that this has been challenged there already? And what would be steps or timelines you would like to see that happen? Thank you.
Thank you. Do we have more questions from the audience? Yes? Here. Please introduce yourself.
Yes, good morning. My name is Alessandro Valdambrini. I work in DevCo, and I am the anti-corruption focal point in DevCo, so for the European Commission. So more than a question, I would just spend 2 minutes to explain what the...
You have only one.
Sorry?
You have only one.
Okay, 1 minute to explain what the European Commission is doing on corruption in development cooperation.
If you can phrase it as a question to the panelists, I will appreciate it.
Okay. No, I would just like to, so maybe my question can be for DFID. The European Commission for the period 2014-2020 will have at least 36 programs that will include anti-corruption plus in budget support, we're going to have 16 state-building contracts, so the way to support fragile countries with budget support, which will embed, of course, also anti-corruption measures. We are having the same problem like you on how to measure corruption. There will be an indicator on corruption in the new EU result framework that will be adopted. How do you think that we can join forces in measuring corruption? Because the problem is that the main indicators that the most reliable indicators we find are the one of the World Bank or the World Governance Indicator, but we know that it needs a long time span, as well as the one of Transparency International, the World Corruption Index, but it is a perception index. So how do you think that can we work to better and more effectively measure corruption through reliable indicators? Thanks.
Thank you for that question. We will take one more question from the side. Please introduce yourself.
Merci. Je suis Madame.
Thank you. I come from Mali. I'm from a civil society organization. We've spoken a lot about mechanisms that exist in our country. We have many in our country, but in actual fact, they're not efficient or effective. Now, why does the European Union and why do the partner countries not support civil society organizations that aren't actually able to fight and eradicate this phenomenon, which is an educational problem as well? You are are giving much support to our countries where you see that the corruption is continuing, but why are you not helping civil society organizations more to play their role in the fight against corruption? Because that's missing. Thank you.
That's all. We got a question about the situation in Brazil. We got the question about measuring corruption, and of course the last question about the EU support for civil society. Let me also read one of the questions that we got from the EPP ad, and that is, all the time you are talking about transparency, but what are the practical approaches to implement it? So may I ask first Dr. Marquette this time to start with the answers, and then we will continue with the other panelists. Dr. Marquette.
Thank you. I want to point out, first of all, I'm not DFID, so I can't answer on DFID's behalf, although I do know their work very well. I think the problem of measuring corruption is shared. Personally, I think it's one that's intractable. DFID is about to commission a multi-million-pound research center on corruption and anti-corruption, which I'm sure will have that as one of its key tasks. But to me, corruption is so broad that actually trying to find single indicators that measure success that does take over many, many, many years within particular frameworks is impossible. You might as well say, how do you measure love? How do you measure evil? It's about as difficult as doing that. If we focused instead on indirect measures, we might find it easier to measure the success of those, recognizing that they will be cumulative and they will take time. If I could just answer very quickly on civil society. I'm not a donor, so I don't know why there isn't more support. Certainly there is support for civil society or so on. I suspect part of it is that there are a few organizations that tend to receive the bulk of the support, and actually civil society will be multifaceted and so on. For my money, what I would probably invest in if I were a donor was trying to support the growth of reform coalitions that actually bring together civil society, the private sector, government, and so on. And that's where I would invest most of my money. But as I said, I don't have to make that decision, so it's easier to say as an academic than not.
Thank you. Edglison, you got a question, very particular one, from a member of the European Parliament about the situation in Brazil. Please, if you want to answer that.
Okay. No Brasil, eu sou estudante de ciências sociais.
In Brazil, I'm a social sciences student, and I'm also a representative of the youth in a national movement. It's called Youth Monitoring on Public Policies. We empower young people to work together with the local communities in looking at social policy. We look at the problems and try to help to improve areas such as schools and health and so on. We work as mediators, so we fight together with them so that the societies and local communities can have better social services. Now, when we talk about good governance, we are suggesting where the government should invest the public resources, because if not, the government can invest 10 million reais in advertisements and so on, and so as is being done in Fortaleza, my city. But the social movements, of which I'm a member, will fight against that sort of expenditure for the government to use the money elsewhere and in other ways. So we pressure to say what should be done for the government to invest in line with the interests of the population.
If you would like to bring the perspective from the Maldives and Transparency International.
Let me just respond to the question about why civil society is not being do not get enough support in developing countries. I think one of the reasons is that quite often in my experience is that in countries like Maldives, where we are still, our democracy is really nascent. It's still at its infancy, and there's not enough space for civil society, and there's only very few of us there. So sometimes donors have these expectations that civil society organizations in countries like mine needs to have the same sort of infrastructure, organizational structure that is similar to what's in the West. But obviously, it takes many years to form big organizations, and I think that expectation doesn't really meet when it comes to funding civil society organizations. And I also think sometimes in countries like mine, civil society organizations operate as community-based organizations, which means there is one civil society organization per island. So one island may have 500 people in there, and you will have one organization that really works for all issues on the country. So I think it's very contextual as well, but I think that I do agree that there needs to be more support to bring, to build coalitions of civil societies where strong civil societies don't exist in order to make civil societies as equal and active partners in fighting corruption. And in terms of that question about what are the practical measures to fight corruption, I don't think there is one set of answer. It has to be a multi-pronged approach. It needs to come through civic education. It needs to come through enacting laws and also enforcement. So I don't think there's one strict answer to that. And I didn't get your question. You asked a question about, oh, it's for you. Okay, yeah, thank you.
Mr. Steiner, you were also addressed. And of course, you have also a Brazilian background, so please go ahead.
That's why I think what Gleison is doing is so inspiring, because I think it is the one half of the equation, which is public engagement and public debate. But in the combination of what he represents, it's also the recognition you need public policy. And only when you have the public policy can you begin to also challenge governments and very powerful actors in an economy. To your question, which I very much appreciate, the environmental crime report, I think, as such, has not yet received a formal feedback. I know that in the Parliament and also in the Environment Committee, there is debate on particular issues, particularly the illegal trade in wildlife in terms of ivory or rhino is something that has gotten a lot of attention. But I would very much welcome the European Parliament looking at this connection between governance and corruption and natural resources, or sustainability of natural resource use, corruption and governance. I mean, you can frame it from both directions. One, to recognize the magnitude of the issue and how much it drives. In Brazil, land, forestry, corruption and governance are inextricably linked, and there are success stories and there are failures. And this is the story everywhere. Secondly, and I think this may be something where the development and the environment community can also join hands, look at the European demand for natural resources and what it is driving in terms of partner countries, whether it's timber, whether it's fisheries, other natural resources. This demand in Europe and the ability to also legislate against illegal trade is critical. So it's equally something that in the Parliament, I think you can bring these two communities together. And finally, enforcement. I think Europe, through its partnerships, can do a lot more to help countries also enforce laws. This is one of the great Achilles heels. We pass laws, norms, standards, and then there is no enforcement. If there's no enforcement, laws become meaningless. So this is also part of good governance. Thank you.
Thank you for that. One of the issues we touched upon was, of course, the experiences from the Eastern Partnership, but I think that the enlargement process of the EU also could be one of those examples where we can learn some lessons about preventing corruption, building more inclusive institutions. So I'm wondering if, from a Polish perspective, you, Minister, could also tell us something more about your national experience and how this could be useful now to develop a strategy also for the EU to foster good governance in the development cooperation with partners in the developing world.
Yes, thank you. That's correct. We are trying to share our experience with our Eastern partners, not just in the form of sharing the legislation and how the legislation functions and possibly some part of this legislation that could be used in the Eastern Partnership countries, but also how the national bureaus or central bureaus of anti-corruption have been created. We have an experience for more than a decade. We have our own Central Anti-Corruption Bureau being created in 2002. Since, for instance, such bureaus were created in Eastern Partnership countries, specifically in Ukraine, we started to give the technical assistance, but also some training to the newly created bureaus eastwards. But I think what is far more important is the social awareness. This is something which is much more difficult to share, something what is much more difficult to transfer, like it is in the case of legislation or experience how the Anti-Corruption Bureau are functioning. So this we are trying to do through education process at the different levels, including also the exchange of youth, going to the exchange of students at the university level, but also we created in Poland so-called Public Administration School for Eastern Partnership countries. It has been one of the institutions, the very first institution that we created for ourselves at the beginning of the 90s, that basically educated the elite of civil service. Now we modify it into the creating, so to say, giving the training for the elite of Eastern Partnership countries. And we basically also try to address the development funds that we have to such a trainings within the Eastern Partnership Public Administration Academy. So this is one of the instruments. I'm just giving an examples, but of course the scope is much wider.
Dr. Marquette. Still working? Yes. You have a vast experience in research, but also working with partners in Africa. Do you think those experiences from Europe could be useful in this regard? If you can just briefly comment on that.
I mean, I think certainly one of the things that really pricked my attention was around higher education. And I think one of the big tragedies in development assistance in the last 20, 30 years has been the slashing of support for higher education in partner countries. It's very difficult to see how leaders with strong public ethos and so on will emerge without a good university background. And actually, we've been doing some research on this, firstly in Ghana, but now looking at the Philippines, Papua New Guinea, Sri Lanka, and so on, and looking at actually the role that higher education can play in terms of imbuing some of the values that are integral to good governance. Certainly the Ghana case is an excellent one for seeing how over time actually the values learned at secondary and tertiary education have fed into very reform-minded governments. I think that's maybe one lesson that could be taken from that.
Thank you very much for that. And let me also bring to the audience the information that the Director General for External Policies of the European Parliament has just recently published the study on the cost of corruption in developing countries and how effectively is aid being spent. Is available on the website of the European Parliament with a lot of useful information. Now I will ask my colleague Ellie Schlein if she would like to make some concluding remarks for this panel before we just close this session. Please, Ellie.
Thank you, Davor, very much. Well, I think it was a very interesting discussion. I wish to thank all the panelists. They've pointed out, especially in the second part of the discussion, many important things. For example, when you said that we can't tackle corruption without promoting good governance, it sounds very simple, but it's basically very fundamental. And you know, the impact that CSOs, civil society organizations, can have and do have is fundamental, as I said before, in the beginning, but you gave us many concrete examples of what it means in the field. I think that, as I said before, when there was somebody, a woman, who asked why doesn't the EU give more support to this role of the civil society organization in the fight against corruption, it's obviously what you said, but it's also that maybe we are not conscious of how much it means, and I really think that we have to insist also in the DEVE committee on this aspect, because you know I've been working a lot on the issue in not only my country but also in Albania, because I'm in the delegation with Albania of the European Parliament, and of course it's not just we don't have to leave the civil society organization alone, and as I said before in the beginning of the discussion, if we don't don't grant legal, safe and reliable channels for whistleblowers, for example, to denounce facts of corruption, then it's gonna mean that we don't incentivize people to actually blow the whistle. And that means that we, of course, are weaker in the fight against corruption. So I think that the role of, like a bridge of the civil society organization would also profit from the fact that we do grant safe and reliable access channels for, of course, whistleblowers. So I think that we have to keep those things together. And the second thing that's particularly, I think is particularly important is what you all said and pointed out. It's not only creating the laws. It's not enough to create the laws, of course. It's also about implementation of the same laws, and it's also a cultural problem. And I know it very well, and the young people have to do something on it. You know, in Italy, for example, we have a huge problem with not only corruption, but organized crime together with corruption. And the role of civil society there is fundamental. We had in Bologna, in my city, 200,000 people in the streets 2 months ago against corruption and against the role of organized crime. And you know what moves me? Seeing people of 16 years old, younger than me, in the streets explaining what is the role of the mafia and the organized crime in the public procurements. And that means corruption as well. And you know, the fact that at 16 years old, I wasn't even capable of explaining what a public procurement was, means that there are steps forwards in the society. And I really agree that young people can make the difference if they help in spreading this culture for the rule of law, for the good governments, and for the values of course, anti-corruption. And let me just finish by saying this. In our society, and it's not only about developing countries here, seriously, also in our society we have to make sure that everybody knows that people are paying the cost of corruption. It doesn't just involve the corrupted who gets of course, who offers the money and who gets the money. People are paying the cost of corruption. In my country, there are some surveys that show that it's about 1,000 euros per year for every Italian citizen. And I'm pretty sure that at the European level we could do some similar research and discover that it's a very high cost, the one of corruption. If we are successful in spreading the idea that everybody, and as I said before, mostly the most vulnerable and the poorest part of society are paying more, even more. So if we spread that idea, then it's gonna come naturally also to, of course, strengthen the forces of civil society organization and act in a way that we make sure that corruption is not convenient anymore in our society. Because today, we have to say, because of the lack of implementation, because of the lack of support in the civil society role to spread the rule of law as well, today it's convenient, and we have to make sure that it's not convenient anymore in the future. So thanks a lot, everybody, for your contribution. I think that we really had a fruitful debate, and maybe you can, as a guest and a very good moderator, I would suggest also to thank our moderator with an applause.
Thank you for that.
You can close.
I have this one. I guess this is the grand coalition in the parliament working. Thank you very much also for bringing this concept of universality. I think is one of the key changes in the new global development framework. The Millennium Development Goals did a lot of good, but they were just for the developing nations. What we would like to see in New York in September is to have a new global development framework with a new set of sustainable development goals, but that will be applicable to all. So that will be universal. And certainly, tackling the issue of corruption is not just an issue for developing nations, but for developed nations as well, as it was suggested before. I think this is one of the key messages that could be, as a conclusion, strengthened in this high-level panel. I would like to thank you, all the panelists, and you to be a great audience. Let me just invite the audience to have a big clap to all our panelists. And I will invite you to continue with all the other activities in the European Development Days. Thank you very much.